For the quiz tomorrow, you need to know stuff from chapter 12. It will be open note quiz. So you can use your water cycle picture from Tuesday and Wednesday, and also your worksheets or notes from yesterday and today. So this is what we did yesterday. We also, this will be, questions about this will be on the quiz. The fact that 97% of the water on Earth is salt waters, and most of the fresh water is ice. So a couple other words you needed to know. A watershed is an area that of the water that runs into a certain river system. So it's a little bit strange, but so basically the Colorado River watershed is all the mountains and area where that water runs into the Colorado River. It's a little hard to see here, but if you think about, so this is the Continental Divide. So, oops, the Continental Divide, on this side of the Continental Divide, all of the water goes to the Atlantic Ocean, Mississippi River, Gulf of Mexico, and on this side of the Continental Divide, it goes to the Pacific Ocean. So we talked about that a little bit when we talked about erosion and runoff. But watersheds are important because all of the water, so we are right about here, here's the South Platte River. We don't think of ourselves as being in the Mississippi watershed, but we are. But so from where we live, the water goes into the South Platte, it goes into the Missouri, it goes into the Mississippi. Because we live near the mountains here, a lot of the water that we get, our drinking water, our irrigation water, actually comes from snowmelt and from reservoirs up in the mountain. And so we have really, in some ways, a much more direct water source than other people. People that live out here, they depend on the aquifers and that. They depend on water that falls here where we are to go into the watershed to go there. So watershed, you can think of a shed as where you keep something, the watershed, or this is the area where the water is shed off of that and goes into the different river systems. So not a huge thing, but when we talk about where does our water come from, that's that. This was kind of a minor thing. It was one of the questions. What's the difference between a pond or a lake? Most people know a pond is smaller, a lake is bigger. To me, this is almost kind of an interesting trivia question, so not a big deal. But basically, the interesting technical difference is that a pond is shallow enough that sunlight can reach all parts. So sunlight can reach all the way to the bottom. So not extremely important, but because the pond, it can go all the way, the water reaches all the way to the bottom, then it's different living things that can survive there. Not a hugely important thing, but interesting. Okay, this one was on there. Wetlands. Wetlands are interesting because they used to mostly be called swamps and marshes. And now we call them wetlands, which I think sounds nicer. But wetlands are really interesting because I think in the past they were seen as kind of a nuisance. They're messy, they're stinky, and people would drain the wetlands so you could have more livable area. But it turns out, as you read in the book here, that the wetlands are actually really important because a couple things. One is they filter and clean the water. Two is they have a tremendous amount of living things. But three, and this is the one that I think people didn't fully understand, is that wetlands help control floods. And so this is an area, and remember when we talked about the flooding and we talked about like the Boulder Creek path and our Coal Creek path, you've got that wider area. It's not exactly a wetland, but it's a similar type of a concept where instead of saying, okay, we're going to put the river in this narrow area and drain the rest of the water so we can have houses here, then when you have flooding, the water goes back to where it wants to go. If you leave areas like wetlands and those big wide areas around the creeks, then in times of flooding, there's more space for that water to spread out. So that was wetlands. One of the questions on the worksheet was name the 3 different types of wetlands. I don't really care about that, but know basically what one is and why it's important not to just drain them out and build houses instead. Yeah, it was, well, but what it's like marsh, swamp, and bog. Yeah. Well, the thing is, here in Colorado, we don't have many of them. right? We live in a fairly dry climate. So yeah, don't worry. Don't spend lots of time memorizing those. Now, an aquifer is interesting though. And aquifers, this is where the groundwater is. And this is, again, we get our water from reservoirs and from snow runoff. But other places, even eastern Colorado or places on the Great Plains, they get their water from aquifers. And what that is underground, there'll be areas, I mean, it's not really a lake underground, but it's areas underground where there's kind of bigger rocks, there's lots of space between the rocks, and this is where there's water underground. And so these are the permeable layers. You might remember the word permeable from last year. Cells have a semi-permeable membrane. Some things can get through. Well, so when it rains, as the water gets absorbed in, some of it's right down here. I should draw the water in blue, where the plants can get out of it, and some of it's deeper in the aquifers. And then this says it's an impermeable layer, and so it's clay, it's very dense, and so the water goes down and then kind of sits on top of here. So if you can make, and that's called the water table, if you could drill a well down here, you can access that water. And I believe, yes, this next page has these, one of the questions is, what is an artesian well? And I'm not going to ask you that, but basically, most wells, like these wells here, here's a well, you drill all the way down into the water table, and you put a little pump house, and you pump the water out. An artesian well is such that there's enough water pressure that it comes out without pumping it. That's all it means, is you don't have to pump it up. And so an artesian well, kind of like a spring where the water is just going to come out. And here's your aquifers. And then one of the other questions, why might a well dry up? Well, if the level of the aquifer drops, or say the city is, different cities are taking the water out of here, or the mining companies come in and use water to do fracking or whatever, it might use the water. And in a similar way to a pond or a lake having a lower water level, if this water level's lower, then this well might dry up. And then in really wet years, lots and lots and lots of rain, the water level might be higher. Okay. Very exciting. Next. That is, let's see. And then the last thing, just kind of a little summary, drinking water, and some people had asked about this. So in the water cycle, when water evaporates, only the water evaporates, and all the other, the salt, the chemicals, the insects, the particles, they all stay behind. But in many places, well, in all places you have some sort of water treatment plant. So all the water that we flush into the sewer, from our houses, from our sinks, from everything, even the stuff that just runs down the, the gutters into the, some of that actually goes directly to the creeks. But anything that goes into the sewers can go to a water treatment plant. And the interesting thing is we can kind of recycle the water to some extent, which on one hand seems really disgusting, and on the other hand is actually really useful. And so this is just straight out of our textbook. But I know a couple of years ago, kids asked me, like, how exactly do you do that? Because how gross does that seem that you're taking sewer water and putting it back into drinking water? So there's a couple things that happens. The first thing, and this, knowing the general concept is good enough. You don't have to know all these steps, but the way it works, first filtration. So obviously they filter out all the big stuff, big screens and nets, remove fish, leaves, and trash. Okay, and other stuff. And then water treatment, coagulation. Now, alum, that's just a chemical, potassium aluminate salt. It's added to form sticky flocks. So basically, it makes this stuff in the water that other stuff is attracted to. And so you add this chemical, and it makes this kind of foamy stuff. And then mud, bacteria, and other particles stick to the flocks. So then you're taking out some of the waste out of it, the littler stuff, even microscopic stuff like bacteria. So all that nasty stuff is going to come out of the water. Then you move it to a big tub, and the water and flocks sink to the bottom. So then all of that bacteria, nasty stuff that was in solution, so instead of now, disgusting, muddy brown water, you're going to have water that's a little bit more clear, and then that stuff settles to the bottom. Then, of course, it doesn't show you that. Oh, second filtration. But so then you can take this stuff, and I know in some places in Colorado, again, seems a little bit disgusting, but this stuff right here, you can use for fertilizer, right? We use things like cow and sheep manure to fertilize our gardens. If it comes from human waste, it's a little bit, you have to make sure it's not going to cause disease and stuff. But there are some farms, there are some water treatment places, they take this and use it or treat it even more so it's not, dangerous, and use it for fertilizer. So then you've kind of recycled that. Then, and I kind of like this because now the water has gone from yucky green to blue, and that makes us happier. So then they settle all this. Second filtration, the water trickles down through sand or gravel, which is interesting because in nature, when it rains or whatever and the water goes down through the permeable layers into the aquifers, that actually acts as a filter. So we do a very similar filter in water treatment plants, similar to what happens in nature. The water trickles down through sand or gravel, filters out more algae, bacteria, some chemicals, and then we add chlorine. Like in the swimming pool, only not that much. Chlorine kills the remaining bacteria and living things. And the good thing about chlorine, not only does it kill all of this, but chlorine, sometimes when you first turn on the faucet, you can smell a little bit of the chlorine, but if you let the water sit out, the chlorine volatilizes, the chlorine goes into the atmosphere, and so there's not chlorine left in the water. And here, then they bubble air through it, which releases gases, and some of the chlorine bubbles out, and so that reduces unpleasant odors and taste. That sounds really gross, doesn't it? And then finally, sodium or lime may be added to soften hard water. Some communities add fluoride to the water because it helps prevent tooth decay. It's kind of funny. It's something that's been done since, I think, the 60s. City water, they put fluoride in the water because it helps us have better teeth. In some areas, just the natural water has some fluoride in it. And then you have your tap water. So that happens in many areas. So we can recycle a certain amount of the water that we use. And then we filter it again. And it's really interesting because depending on where you live, here in Colorado, or here especially in Boulder County, we have really good, fresh, good tasting water, right? Because it comes fairly directly from the mountains. If you live even in Denver or some of the eastern parts of Colorado, the water doesn't taste as good because it's been through more of these processes before you drink it, or it's from aquifers out of the ground, and it's it's not as good. Okay, so that is the main thing. These are just some of the other worksheets I've given in the past, but that is long enough for a flip lesson. Use your notes and stuff notes and worksheets for the quiz.